So we're right at 1 p.m., perfect timing to continue on to our next speaker, who is Kai Merkeley, giving a paper entitled Reimagining Gender, Why Trans Studies Matters for Classics. Okay, so Kai Merkeley is a PhD candidate in classical philology and was recognized with the 2022 Lorraine Y. Cowan Make a Difference Advocacy for LGBTQ Affairs Award for their remarkable talents as a teacher who both respects and engages with diversity and helps create community in ways that go far beyond the classroom. This award honors students, staff, or faculty who have demonstrated their commitment to supporting and promoting lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer affairs at Illinois. Merkeley's dissertation sits at the intersection of transgender studies and classics and analyzes the ways in which modern conceptions of gender have erased the gender fluid and diverse gendered identities that existed in the Roman Empire and strives to uncover how gender is defined and functions within Roman society. Kai founded Trans in Classics in 2020, a working group and community for trans, non-binary, and gender nonconforming classicists that strives to create a community for trans classicists, develop resources and materials for the trans community, and promote transgender readings and transgender histories of the ancient Mediterranean. Okay, so I'm so excited to welcome Kai Merkeley. And again, the title of the talk is Reimagining Gender, Why Trans Studies Matters for Classics. Thank you, Kai.
So today I'd like to start by addressing the question, why do we need to reimagine gender anyway? The answer is simple. There is a cisgender lens that is often unconsciously applied to our histories and our readings of literature, and without foreknowledge of this lens, it's far too easy to continue to produce cisgender histories and cisgender scholarship without having any idea of the kinds of suppositions that we are importing into our work. I'll start with a brief personal anecdote. When my co-editor and I sent out a call for chapters for the Cultural History of Trans Lives, Volume 1, Antiquity, the Classical Association of the Middle West and South graciously posted the call on social media, hoping to help us reach as many academics as possible. Their account was immediately flooded with a transphobic backlash against the mere existence of such an edited volume, against the idea that trans people could have a past in the classical world. After a long moment of shock at the idea that such a thing would even happen, CamWest proceeded to scrub the post of transphobic comments and lock their account so that fewer people could reply. However, one comment notably remained. Cross-dressing homosexual men have existed throughout history, yes. I presume that this comment remained because it was not perceived by the CamWest moderators as openly transphobic. But it is this very kind of erasure that shows why trans history is so important. Notice what is erased in this kind of transphobic reframing. First, transmasculine individuals are entirely erased. In a patriarchal world, the assumption is made that women would naturally want to be men. Second, any cross-gender behavior is reductively reduced to cross-dressing, which in this post is then tied to gay men, as if cross-dressing and being gay obviously must go together. This post reduced the entire spectrum of lived experiences that trans represents down to a single example, the specific gendered performance of effeminate gay men cross-dressing. Notice, in this example, dressing as a woman, acting like a woman, even potentially being the passive recipient of sex, none of these things allow someone to be something other than a man, as if being a stable category of identity is one of the first and foremost laws of humanity. This type of logic leaves the modern gender binary untroubled, erasing any potential that might exist to transgress and move across the gendered boundaries that a cisgender worldview wants to be inviolable. This logic means that identities that don't cleanly fit into the modern cisgender framing of gender are carefully tidied up. Third genders are neatly applied to cultures that are different from our own, and often exoticized in order to emphasize the primitive nature of cultures that aren't like ours. Other examples are merely labeled and explained away as various exceptions to gendered categories. Oh, it was just a religious category, or that person must have just been intersex. The effect is to erase even the potential for a trans past. Trans Antiquity, a 2017 volume of collected essays on transgender identities in the ancient world, starts its very analysis of gender from this very premise. Starting from the premise that new vocabulary has the power to generate the object it defines, it is clear that a transgender identity has existed only since the last decade of the 20th century. Defining transgender as the modern concept of, quote, performative gender self-reassignment, end quote, trans antiquity relies on the importance of surgery, hormones, and modern conceptions of a gender change to define what transgender can mean. The editors ultimately conclude that in Greco-Roman thought, only the gods can make gender change, and so the focus and majority of the volume shifts to the ways in which cross-dressing functions in the ancient world. Now, the Goodreads comments on trans antiquity are really illustrative of the kinds of responses this approach has elicited from the trans community at large. Here's one example from among many. Quote, I hated this book. The editor appears to think there were no trans people in antiquity, which, well, that's your opinion, but it's wrong. So that's the starting point, and the vast majority of the essays are about cross-dressing, with pretenses of a theoretical underpinning based on Garber's work, but honestly, most are really just cataloging behaviors, end quote. This is a volume that is purportedly about a trans past, but which denies the very possibility of that past, and isn't rooted in transgender studies or transgender theory. I've heard it called a, quote, cisgender colonization of the past, end quote. Now, on the other hand, Alison Surtees and Jennifer Dyer's Exploring Gender Diversity in the Ancient World takes the opposite approach. And rather than trying to deny that trans as a category existed, the introduction declares, the essays in this volume show that classical Greek and Roman history is the history of all genders, a history that includes identities that are gender fluid or gender blending, intersex, and transgender. The articles in the section entitled Transgender Identity use a comparative approach, tying modern categories and definitions back to Greco-Roman antiquity in order to generate meaning. For example, in an article on the story of Megillos from Lucian's Dialogues of the Courtesans, Rowan Emily Ash uses the modern classification system from the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, to show that Megillos can be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. In another chapter, Evelyn Atkins does a comparative reading between the Hijra, a gender identity that resists binary categorization from the Indian subcontinent, and the ancient category of gender-liminal religious devotees to Cybele known as the Gali. These chapters use definitions and standards from the present and apply them to the past in order to generate legible categories, proving that the past was more gender diverse than, quote, the cis heteronormative gender binary that dominates today, end quote, would have us believe. Now, while gender diversity in the ancient world explicitly sets out a political goal to support and nurture modern trans individuals, the comparative nature of this approach only provides legitimacy to those who easily fit within the boundaries of the comparative model, oversimplifying the otherness of the past. The two opposite approaches found in trans antiquity and exploring gender diversity in the ancient world create a clear set of polar arguments centered on the desire to prove or disprove that trans people existed in the past. But writing trans history that is focused on denying or proving that there were trans people gives transphobic actors exactly what they want, allowing them to focus on redefining what transgender can even mean, so that they can define trans identities as simply a modern delusion. Transgender studies itself is supremely uninterested in finding trans people in the past. For, of course, gender diverse people have lived in every society and have modified their bodies and appearances in various ways to better live their lives. It's really not a question that needs to be adjudicated. I personally like to follow Kit Hayham's conclusion that trans history need not feature individuals who are obviously trans by today's standards. In Before We Were Trans, Kit concludes, the history in this book is trans history nonetheless. It's a history that shows us the movability of gender. It's a history that shows us that notwithstanding the outraged claims of anti-trans commentators today, what constitutes a man, a woman, or gender itself has continually been defined, contested, and redefined. The quote, movability of gender, end quote, provides a clear starting principle for writing trans histories. In fact, transgender theory's most important innovations do not have necessarily to do as much with the prefix trans as they have to do with understanding gender itself, and how gender and its categories are constantly shifting, moving, and changing. I'm reminded of Claire Colbrick's call to see in trans not just a moving between gender categories, but the potential to move outside of gender categories, to a universal place that exists before gender categorizes us all. In this sense, trans theory shows us that stable transhistorical cisgender identities are the true illusion. Such work is uncomfortable. It asks us to put aside our comfortable preconceptions, and sometimes even our own hard-fought gender identities, and consider a world where gender just functions differently. This is the place where I think transgender studies is at its best, when it asks us to sit with our discomfort and question the assumed realities we make about gender. Trans history calls us to remember that while homosexual, queer, or various iterations of trans might indeed be modern concepts that cannot be cleanly put on past identities, so are the concepts of gender, man, woman, the self, identity, and even bodies. We should critique all past categories with the same intensity that we critique and examine trans. For within the traces we can see of trans potentiality in the past are the tools necessary to examine and deconstruct gender itself. Trans serves as a useful methodological tool to move outside of and beyond the systems of categorization that tie certain human bodies to certain categories in order to make them legible. Undoing gender and stepping outside of this system of categorization allows us to reframe the axis of otherness and the otherness of the past versus legibility in the present, and instead focus on the ways that these texts, their language, and their underlying symbolic world create and support hegemonic institutions, social norms, and hierarchical structures, consigning certain types of bodies to being an other. Such insights provide a different window into examining how conceptions of embodiment, personal identity, and social identities in antiquity differed from our own conceptions and ideals. At the same time, trans history should support and empower trans people today. For despite the vast differences that exist with the past, there are still moments that resonate with current trans experience. Gil Latino perfectly captured the sentiment, saying, "It's not your past to claim, but it still somehow slant rhymes with your present." The material for trans history is found in these resonances and the past experiences of gender they imply. Hill goes on and continues, "I'm haunted by these archival specters and by my sense of duty to them, because in some small way, by existing, however minimally or maximally, however part-time or full-time they have made our existence possible. Because our lives are in some opaque and difficult to capture way entwined. Because I want to do justice to their struggles and joys." End quote. Trans history, much like queer history, is often created from metaphorical palimpsests. The underlying trans potential of a text has been rubbed away and written over by cisgender presumptions of what gender possibilities are even allowed to be. To write trans history is to imagine alternate possibilities and uncover the traces of a trans past, however minimal or maximal they might be. Now, modern discourse around gender often starts with the sexed body and a presumed binary between male and female. This presumed binary means that anything outside of a clear male-female dichotomy is merely defined as not male or not female. But such a definition cannot even begin to handle the ambiguities of categorization that exist within Greco-Roman texts. We get examples and terms such as hermaphroditus, semiweir, conitus, heteristria, androgyno, androgyne, tribos, the Galli, etc. I could go on naming terms. Each of these words falls into the category of not male, not female, but the massive range of difference in these terms requires a model of gender that is much more expansive than male, female, or non-binary. In order to define gender in the ancient world, I would propose eliminating the binary entirely, instead viewing gender as a process through which bodies, both normative and non-normative, are assigned and move between a range of possible categories. Viewing gender as a process that engages a dialectic that's between an individual's desired place in society and the system of norms, behaviors, and disciplinary mechanisms that exist on a larger societal level, allows us to bypass much of the current philosophical debate surrounding gender and what it means, and instead focus on the specifics, categories, their function, and perhaps most importantly, how those categories are mediated by bodies at various different historical moments. Put another way, gender is the process of wanting a social place, performing an act which requests that social place be granted, and having that performance recognized and accepted by another. I really like Gil Malentino's articulation of gender as an act of supplication. We must ask for a gender, and it needs to be given to us. First, the act of supplication is always based in some material practice. There is something we must do to be given a gender. Second, choosing to give the supplicant what they ask for provides proof that they can occupy that gender category. So these moments of gender supplication show gender in action, creating opportunities to write trans history as someone attempts to move between gender categories, however brief or momentary this movement might be. And in Greco-Roman literature, it's important to recognize that these gender changes often are momentary. Bodies themselves were considered notoriously unstable, with debate over why bodies might move between various sexed categories. And this movement of bodies and potential sexual flexibility allowed for movement between gender categories as well. And at the same time, bodies also could change because of clothing, social practices, and potential behavior, meaning that gender itself seems fairly malleable in some of these texts. But cisgender presumptions have narrowed down the possibility of understanding gender differently, covering over moments where someone's gender shifts or moves categories with an assumed unchanging binary, erasing the trans potential of the texts. So today, quickly, I'd like to share just 3 brief examples to present you with some of the possibilities that trans studies might bring to our field. In Lucian's 5th Dialogue of the Courtesans, a hetaira named Leina recounts to another woman, named Clonarion, a sexual encounter she had with 2 women, named Demonassa and Megilla. Clonarion has heard about this and wants all the details of what happened. Leina explains that in the midst of Demonassa, Megilla, and Leina's sexual encounter, Megilla removed a wig and declared himself a man by the name of Megillos. Leina is shocked and confused. The sex scene promptly stops, and a philosophical conversation begins between Megillos and Leina. Leina attempts to figure out what Megillos's claim to be a man means, and asks him if he is like Achilles, dressing and living as a woman, but really a man, like Hermaphroditus, having been born, having both male and female parts, or if he is like Tiresias, transformed by the gods. Megillos answers no to each of these, finally declaring he was born like all other women, but has the mind desires, and everything else a man has, except a penis. Eventually, Megillus and Leina resolve to test Megillus' claim to be a man by finishing their sexual encounter, at which point Leina denies Megillus' masculine identity and genders him as her again, which concludes Leina's story. Modern scholarship on this dialogue has often been preoccupied with trying to provide Megilla or Megillos a stable, unchanging identity across the dialogue, focusing on what Megillah can teach us about female homoeroticism in the ancient world. But trans studies provides us an entirely different lens through which to interpret this episode. Megillus' act of taking off a wig allows him to claim masculinity, an act which exposes the deep interrelationship between clothing, behavior, and identity itself. Leina then attempts to understand Megillus' claim, revealing how gender works in this text. She examines the available exceptions to gendered norms, and then ultimately chooses to police Megillus' gender expression. This text shows that re-embodiment, the intentional changing of appearance, lost my place here. That re-embodiment suggests that gender and identity are fluid, contestable, and precarious in the sociocultural world of the early Roman Empire. But in the history of translations of this text, Megillah's transformation into Megillus has been constantly erased, as cisgender translations have attempted to render gender and gender categories as legible as possible, assigning Megillah a clear gender category in modern terms. By mapping clear categories onto past conceptions of gender, Megillah is given a stable, unchanging gender, thereby reifying cisgender norms and making Megillah more palatable to modern audiences. Another example, when Hercules dons female clothes, swapping clothing with Omphale, does his identity change? Is his masculinity undamaged by his momentary re-embodiment? Or is he even more masculine because of his stint being a woman? In Proportius 4:9, Hercules himself acknowledges that he literally was a puella, declaring fui puella. Latin authors have regularly employed narrative tools to shape how their audiences understand and resolved Hercules' shifting gender, with additional information shaping the potential consequences or lack thereof to Hercules' identity. A good example comes from Ovid's Fausti, where Hercules' cross-dressing is clearly labeled as heroic and masculine. As Hercules puts on the clothes, he finds that the belt was too small for his waist. He undid the clasps of the tunic so that he might be able to thrust out his massive hands. He'd broken the bracelets. They weren't made for those arms. His big feet were ripping apart the dainty shoes. In the Fausti, clothing cannot affect Hercules' masculinity. And ultimately, Hercules saves the day because he is wearing women's clothing, preventing Faunus from raping Omphale. However, in the Herodes, Ovid employs a whole nexus of words to depict Hercules' wearing of women's clothing as shameful and effeminizing. Was it not shameful for those strong arms to be restrained by gold and for gemstones to be placed on your unyielding muscles? Narrative choices shape how audiences receive the moment of embodiment, justifying it or condemning it. Hercules' momentary act of becoming a woman and his potentially safe return to masculinity illustrate how moments of re-embodiment and of shifting gender could be used to ultimately reaffirm hegemonic masculinity. However, the precarity of Roman masculinity means that turning re-embodiment into kind of a game was potentially dangerous to one's identity. I find in this game of re-embodiment subtle parallels across much of Roman culture in places such as elegiac poetry, declamation, education, and oratory. With these parallels in mind, I find that the term hegemonic cross-gender play captures both Hercules and his gender movements and more subtle parallels where men enter femininity on purpose in order to self-author their own identity across masculinity and femininity. A third example. When Achilles is on the Isle of Skyros, he lives as a weirgo, dressed as a girl at the command of his mother Thetis, in order to protect him from being enlisted in the expedition against Troy. In this episode, Achilles' liminal gender, starting the episode as a puer, moving into young adolescence, literally allows him to become a young woman, an identity he ultimately can only exit with the guidance of another man. Achilles' episode as a maiden demonstrates that the transition from puer to weir was not at all guaranteed, and that the liminality of being an adolescens brought peril. The Skyros episode demonstrates that masculinity and femininity needed to be properly nurtured and protected. Indeed, without this protection, one risked losing their gender identity by either falling into an unsettling liminal space or potentially swapping gender entirely. Cisgender norms have striven to protect the masculine identity of Achilles, for within a patriarchal cisnormative system, Achilles' status as a hero par excellence is troubled if he really became her. A good example of this erasure is found in how Calchas' speech has been interpreted in modern scholarship. In the Accolade, Calchas has a vision of Achilles, and in that vision he proclaims, "Tear them off, boy, tear them off. Don't give in to your cowardly parent." Speaking of the clothing. "Oh, alas, he is snatched away. He is gone. Who is this shameful maiden far off now?" Now, in scholarship, the identity of the Virgo has almost always been assumed to be Diodomian. But there is no reason to read the text this way. Diodomia is not mentioned anywhere else in Calchas' speech, and the only obvious antecedent is Achilles herself. Indeed, before and after this moment, Achilles is explicitly labeled as a Virgo. When Thetis leaves the Isle of Skyros, she prays, "Let Achilles be, a maiden of pious Lycomedes." And when Achilles finally exits from this state of being a Virgo, becoming a man again, Peleus' daughter is sought. Achilles is recognized as occupying the social place of a maiden. Since the hero's place as a category is to help define what a proper man should look like, Achilles literally being a Virgo disrupts the stability of gender that modern norms would like Achilles to have. So, adaptations and retellings of the Achilles story relocate his gender identity into forms that cleanly fit into modern paradigms, an act which guarantees that Achilles does not trouble conceptions of gender too much. These adaptations in turn shape how ancient stories of Achilles are translated and transmitted, turning Achilles into just another, quote, man in a dress, end quote. These stories and their trans potential reveal a world where gender was by no means guaranteed. Gender was an object that could and did change with flowing and contestable meanings and understandings. In fact, within this literature, we see a world where the modern cis-normative ideals of gender, that gender is stable and unchanging, seem more foreign to the text than transgender readings, which expect gender to be fluid and unchanging. Today, I'd like to extend to each of you an invitation to see how trans studies might help inform your own work and your own teaching. For trans studies can't be done by a small handful of trans classicists alone, and cisgender academics can't do trans studies well without engaging with trans people and their lived experiences. In order to do this work, we need each other. So I'd invite you to contact Trans in Classics to join our mailing list and start finding and helping us organize events so that we can begin to do the work of organizing a trans studies subfield. For the simple truth is that trans scholars cannot do this work alone. If I were to bring up the real res difficilis that confronts trans studies in classics, it's the fact that trans scholars doing trans studies too often cannot get jobs. Much of the best work being done in trans studies in the pre-modern world at large has been done by independent scholars, or scholars who do not have a traditional academic appointment. Trans studies work in the pre-modern world suffers heavily at the hands of peer reviewers who don't understand the field, providing additional hurdles to getting work published. Trans studies need support from established, tenured cisgender scholars who are willing to engage and learn from those far less privileged than themselves. Together, we need to imagine ways to build networks of support for work that is not created inside the boundaries of the academy, and to include voices that often find themselves at the margins. It is with these hopes that I come to all of you today. For a robust subfield requires a diverse community of people with various levels of experience within and without academia. And to build that community will require some of you to actively take it upon yourselves to join us and learn together with us. I cannot stress enough the benefits that this kind of work brings to our students. I've had the opportunity to visit and speak at several campuses just this spring, and at each campus, as I met with trans students, they stressed how alone they felt, how discouraging it was to try and bring insights from their own lives into their academic works, and the feeling of frustration when those insights were shut down, partly because they didn't have the academic language they needed or sources that they could cite to legitimize what they were trying to say. Our trans students live in a world in which their identities are constantly being attacked and invalidated, and showing them that gender diverse identities have always existed, that gender has always been contested, and that gender categories regularly change provides them a history they desperately need. Thank you.